Continue looking at hypocrisy and privacy. We saw that, it's not easy to pull these concepts apart. They keep coming back together. And one thing that we saw earlier was that we can't simply say, privacy is okay, right? There's criticisms of privacy, but we can't really just say privacy is okay and hypocrisy isn't, right? So they might be related, but one way to split them is just to say that morally privacy is okay and hypocrisy isn't. Because we did see that broad hypocrisy and narrow hypocrisy are sometimes okay. We saw that it's not really a good idea to just condemn broad hypocrisy, right, with that gap and all that, because it leads to counterintuitive results. And we saw that we can generate fairly mundane examples of narrow hypocrisy, where if someone committed it, we would say, oh well, yeah, we don't. That's morally permissible. And in the case of the fundraiser, we might even say, yeah, that person kind of even had a right to be hypocritical in that sense. We really can't condemn them. We shouldn't condemn them. And so in that sense, you can't just say that privacy is okay and hypocrisy isn't, and that's how we'll separate them. And also, as we've seen in earlier videos, that there are problems with privacy too. So let's look a little bit more at privacy. Is it always okay? I think we've already answered that no, it's not. But let's just kind of go back over this. So privacy, some want to say it's overblown, right? It's not even that important. Some writers don't consider it that much, not because they want to get into the detail. Well, because they don't want to get into the details, because in the end, they don't think privacy is that big of a deal or that important of a concept. Maybe, that's always a good question to ask, when you're digging in philosophically, is this really even important? And sometimes the answer to that might be no. But anyways, let's treat it though as if it is important. So those critics that say meh to privacy will say, okay, that's a possibility, but hey, we can't do everything. We're going to put that one to the side and treat privacy as though it is important. But even the ones that say it's not important say it has some value. So it's good just to think about it, that it's limited, right? Like, I have privacy to sit in my living room and no one's looking at me or bugging me. But I don't have, the right to privacy protected by, putting landmines around my windows to keep people from sneaking up on my property or something like that. So there are limitations on privacy, even if it has some value. And remember also, we talked earlier about, the PZ, the privacy zone. We seem to have this intuitive notion that there is something that, maybe it's connected to conventions or society, that each person has a little bit of something that they can legitimately say, hey, this is private, right? And I use, a very basic example of putting doors on washrooms, where we all know what's happening, but it's like, no, we get it. That's part of your that's legitimately and really non-contingently, non-arbitrarily declared to be private. Okay. But again, even if you admit that there is this PZ, the privacy zone, and the public sort of zone, if you like, that where exactly you're going to make the boundary, right? That seems to be a little bit more challenging, even if you agree overall that there is this kind of structure, articulating this structure. That's where people get into arguments. So what are the boundaries? And one of the examples from the text was, if someone has a drinking problem, it's one thing. I guess as a philosophy prof here, before I make a video, if I refuse to drug test or something like that, that's one thing, right? University would have problems with that or whatever. But that's one thing if there's a level of intoxication when somebody does something like that, because it may not have a huge ramification. But on the other hand, if I were an airline pilot, right, that's different. And also, as we know, the effects of alcohol in the system, become much more pronounced at higher altitudes. So, it's a more complex story. So in that certain cases, we might say, okay, maybe in certain cases, that could be protected, or private information about a person if they have this kind of a thing, and we encourage treatment or whatever. But that might be more a sense of being in the zone in that particular case. So not only do we have zones, but how to articulate the zones could depend on a lot of circumstances. But if the person's an airline pilot, we might say, okay, that's a little different, right? So whether or not that's protected medical information is a different story. So that just at least raises the problem again of the boundaries, and it raises them in the sense that the boundaries cannot probably be drawn in general, right? It might say, well, what is the boundary? Well, it depends. What do you do for a living? What are we talking about? So there's all kinds of circumstances. Now, recall that some argue that privacy in general, is bad, right? Why? Because the gap, right, between the private inner self and the external public self is, as some people would say, that is a breeding ground. We should really try to have a society that doesn't require this gap, right? Because it's a breeding ground. It kind of legitimizes hypocrisy. And why do we want to create conditions under which you get more of hypocrisy? Nobody really wants more hypocrisy or really wants it. Don't we want to set things up that we at least get rid of the breeding grounds? It may not cause it, sure, doesn't necessarily cause it, but it creates sort of fertile conditions. So privacy has this negative side of creating conditions for hypocrisy, and also another negative side is it creates isolation and disconnection, because it might even encourage people to be more protective of things. Also, and some people have said that emphasizing privacy could also help uphold oppressive systems, right? So if the public system frowns on something, right? Well, then we say, okay, well, let's create this sort of zone of privacy. So if it frowns on it, the person is protected by it. They don't have to reveal it. And so people can hide all the things that the public system doesn't like. Okay, you can see some sense in that, but doesn't that stabilize the system by saying, well, it kind of, in a way, people could argue that it kind of legitimizes it by saying, okay, well, that's there. We'll accept that's there, this oppressive system. I'm stacking the deck a little bit by calling it an oppressive system. But anyways, it's a normative system. It says something is wrong that people are doing. And then the counter to saying something is wrong is, well, we'll hide it. So we'll bury it, right? And we'll make sure that people aren't punished for indulging in it, but we'll just bury it. And you could argue that, well, that just stabilizes everything, right? The system is here. It says it's wrong. Okay, we'll bury it. So we're not really fighting against the system. We're actually we're just hiding from it. So is privacy a form of hiding, right? And safe hiding? So it may preserve safety, but it also could be argued as reinforcing a system that might be quite distasteful. So again, it drives the real, so then you get a public self, and then the real self is driven underground, right? And so that driving things underground argument is often used, in favor, it's often used against certain kinds of public policies. Well, if you do that, you might protect this behavior by giving it a way to go underground, but that's not good for the people that are going underground. That's horrible for them, right? Even if they are protected in one way, it could, drive the real selves underground and isolation, disconnection. This is not a good idea, right? So privacy, then protecting us from oppressive systems, OS with a little s, isn't that kind of backwards, right? Isn't that sort of like, the old don't ask, don't tell kind of thing? Isn't it sort of along those lines? Maybe not identical, but isn't it similar to that? This seems to be backwards, that privacy protects us from oppressive systems. No, it doesn't. Instead, if you have an oppressive system, and that system, if an oppressive system says, let's put a little s here, says that Q is wrong, don't create privacy zones that you could put Q in there. That privacy zone, gives you a protected way to indulge in Q. You should dismantle the oppressive system that doesn't like Q in the first place. It's like, no, there's nothing wrong with Q, and it's just this system that says it's wrong. Well, we often say, well, to someone who declares, if you're doing something and someone says, well, what you're doing is wrong, it's like, well, I don't have to listen to you, and I'm not going to let you run the show. Well, isn't that just an extension of that argument if we say, well, if this oppressive system, whatever it happens to be, says that Q is wrong. We don't have to listen to that. Let's get rid of this oppressive system. Not trying to hide what we're doing from it. This is all backwards. So privacy seems to be a good thing, say these kinds of critics. But in the end, it actually helps stabilize things we don't want and entrenches them by letting them sit there, govern the public show, and on the things that maybe people do want, gets driven underground. And so what we should be doing is dismantling these oppressive systems that declare Q is wrong. In other words, we need more open societies. That's what we should have. So if you indulge in something that some Q and you have an open society, well, you don't need protection. You don't need this privacy zone because the society is open. You're not going to get punished if people know. All right. And you might be thinking, I'm not so sure about this. And that's a pretty natural reaction. It sounds pretty nice in theory, right? If you say, oh, well, let's just make it where all the things that were bad and punished before become accepted in society. And let's, try to get away from privacy and that kind of stuff. Well, it sounds one thing, it's kind of nebulous in theory, but when people have tried to do that, when they've tried to get rid of privacy zones and eliminate these things and get a society that doesn't really have privacy, you end up with this harsh kind of uniformity, right? You end up in these societies, they tend to be totalitarian regimes, right? So you might say something like, look, I'm not saying that privacy is this absolute be all and the value and you protect it at any cost. No, we can be a little bit more moderate in our notions of privacy, but we kind of need it as a bulwark against totalitarian societies that want to crush the whole notion of privacy. And you'll end up with disaster, conformity, a harsh conformity. Because people may be in places where they will just be conforming. Maybe they will conform completely out of fear, and the privacy zone will be driven even further inside. Maybe there's a natural privacy zone that we have. Orwell explores this idea in 1984, and Huxley in Brave New World, they explore these ideas that there might be these real internal zones that you will just have unless you ultimately corrupt them. Or drive them really internally. So if I try as a totalitarian state to try and get rid of the privacy zone, I can't really get rid of it. I can just make it smaller and smaller, but I can't quite crush it out of existence. Even if I put cameras in your home. So I put cameras in your home. So then you will have your quote unquote public persona even in your own home, but the zone will be driven into your mind and could lead to even greater problems. And then if you do the Huxley model where I'm going to go and just put drugs into you and I'm going to try and crush that privacy zone where you don't even want that zone anymore. I'm going to try and get in and affect you so deeply that you don't want that zone. If I crush that right out of you, I mean, what's even left? Some philosophers would say that you're not really even a real person anymore. You don't really have your own set of desires. They've all been handed to you. Your free will and your decision making has all been completely stripped. So either you crush that zone down to, almost as like this little singularity in the mind and you create kind of a distorted person, or you crush it right out of existence and you don't even really have a person left. So privacy in that sense might, how we understand it might be intrinsically necessary to the very existence of us as persons. Okay, so it gets into some pretty interesting kind of metaphysics. So, but overall, the response might be, this is not really realistic. And if you did put it into place, you'd get kind of disasters and misery. Yes, say the defenders of privacy, it might be part of us. You can overvalue, even though privacy is important. Yes, it's possible to overvalue it and be ridiculous about it, even dangerous about it. But crushing it out and trying to get rid of it is a bad idea. So don't eliminate it. Don't overvalue it. And maybe we should be thinking of privacy and hypocrisy kind of on a continuum, right? And this might be susceptible or dependent on social circumstances and cultures. Different cultures might have notions of what's in the privacy part, and if you go too far, then that might be in the hypocrisy part. So the two things might not be easily distinguishable. They might not be easily distinguishable for all cultures and all times. No, maybe these things are flexible, kind of open-ended concepts. It's just a complex relationship. And again, I think we can take a lesson from Wittgenstein is that privacy and hypocrisy aren't concepts in the sense of, being an apple or being a mathematical object might be conceptualized. No, they're practices, right? The practice of privacy, the practice of hypocrisy. And because they're practices, they may just not lend themselves to a nice, clear, necessary, and sufficient condition. And so we can't really articulate them in terms of like a general distinction or a general difference, as we saw earlier when we had a little thesis about morally condemning narrow hypocrisy. Didn't seem to really work. It'd say, there's good exceptions and maybe, very narrow exceptions to the notion of condemning moral hypocrisy. So maybe we have to just settle that these things are practices, they're on a continuum, and we just can't really nail down exactly the distinction between the two. Nonetheless, it's an interesting discussion and an interesting to think about exactly what is this relationship between privacy and hypocrisy, and it's probably an evolving one. See you next video.